There is a fundamental problem with the premise in this motion. Rejoin. Rejoin, as if we were joining something that was the same that we'd left. It is not. The European Union has changed fundamentally. Its engine, the Franco-German alliance, is shattered. Schengen is in disarray. The continent is wrestling with the rise of the far right. And as my honourable friend has made absolutely clear, we could not expect to rejoin on the terms on which we left. Mr. President, it is a privilege to have followed the noble Lord. There is no doubt about his passion and his expertise over many years, however much I may disagree with him. So, comrades, the last time I came into this chamber to debate, it was to defend the government, an emotion of confidence. And I arrived to discover that the person who was supposed to be supporting me in that endeavour, the Home Secretary, had failed to show, and that the Chancellor had been sacked whilst I was on the train on the way here. I was hoping for a more solid wicket this evening. Comrades, here in Oxford, where Tolkien taught and created his masterpiece, it is important, I think, to draw attention to the most ancient and wisest of his creations, the Ents. And what was the essential wisdom that the Ents imparted to the hobbits? It was not to be so hasty. Comrades, we gave our membership of the European Union over 40 years before we entered that great Ent moot in 2016 and decided that we wanted to leave. The question of being out for 8 years, we've actually only been left since just after 2020. We've barely given it 3 years, years which have been entirely taken up with the problems of a war in Europe and recovery from a pandemic. We would do well to give ourselves much more time to consider the prospects and the effect of our departure before we change our arrangements once again. There is a fundamental problem with the premise in this motion. Rejoin. Rejoin, as if we were joining something that was the same that we'd left. It is not. The European Union has changed fundamentally. Its engine, the Franco-German alliance, is shattered. Schengen is in disarray. The continent is wrestling with the rise of the far right. And as my honourable friend has made absolutely clear, we could not expect to rejoin on the terms on which we left. Margaret Thatcher's negotiation for a huge rebate in our membership fee will no longer be available to us. Neither will the opt-outs that John Major negotiated be available to us, not least the treaty obligation to join the single currency. None of that will be available to us. We should give it much more mature thought before we consider what it is that we're joining. But of course, it's the economics that they always bring to our attention. The fact that our economic prospects are diminished by the fact that we've left. Well, that argument is somewhat undermined by the fact that during the referendum campaign, we were told on the basis of Treasury forecasts that from the moment we voted to leave, we would have an immediate recession in the second half of 2016, with unemployment rising by 10,000 a month. Actually, employment rose by almost 10,000 a month, and we ended 2016 as the best performing developed economy. But of course, the issue is the statistic that they want to trade, and we've just heard it, that the economy will be in years to come 4 to 6% smaller than it would otherwise have been. But the genesis of that statistic is exactly the same Treasury paper that gave rise to the initial ridiculous and wholly wrong forecast. Now, the reality is this. The science of economic prediction is highly uncertain. It comes down to the flawed assumptions that are put in and the incomplete data. And we've just had a new analysis from the business school at Aston in the last few weeks, which first of all complains about the rather disappointing performance of our membership of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CCTPP. Well, it should not have escaped the boffins that our membership of that partnership does not actually begin until the 15th day of next month. Furthermore, it goes on to analyze our export performance over 1,645 categories of export and announces a catastrophic fall. What they had not spotted is not that the exports had fallen, and you would have thought the boffins at a business school would cottoned onto this, not that the exports have fallen, but that the codes under which they are recorded have been altered, and they fundamentally missed the data that was there staring at their faces if they had only inquired further. But let's be clear, when it comes to the economic case, our prosperity, irrespective of whether we're in or out of the European Union, will depend on how hard we are prepared to work, and indeed how many people we can induce to go to work at all, increasingly. It will depend on our risk appetite, and it will depend on how business-friendly our tax and regulatory regime is, not upon the treaties that we sign. But I put this to you, that in a world where we have to be increasingly flexible and agile, a competitive world, that agility and flexibility will be better furnished where we are able to pursue our own national interests swiftly, rather than rely on mechanisms that require us to negotiate a qualified majority with 27 other member states. But set aside the economic argument. I voted to leave the European Union, not because I thought that we would be better off out of it. I've always thought that the economic case was always basically at the margin. It might make some difference, and we'd spot that in 40 years' time, hence the reason not to be too hasty. My reason for leaving the European Union was that it was increasingly obvious to us that we were becoming governed by people that we did not elect and who we could not remove. An entirely appointed commission, a stitch-up that we never got the wherewithal to work out how to stitch it up ourselves, and a council of ministers that held their meetings and deliberations in camera. And I as a minister, was part of that process. And often enough, we would know that we were on a hiding to nothing, and we wouldn't push the matter to a vote because we knew we'd lose. But on the 72 occasions where we really wanted to show that we were really very cross, on those 72 occasions, and when we pushed it to a vote, we were on the losing side. Yes, on 72 occasions. No longer, comrades, are we required to accept arrangements that are, in our view, frankly disastrous. The Common Agricultural Policy, which was so devastating to the developing economies of the world in its early years, and then in its latest iteration, contributed so handsomely to our own diminution of biodiversity and environmental degradation. No longer are we required to put up those arrangements, and we have put in place remedies under our own arrangements to do so. We are once again governed by people that we elect, and we can remove, even if there is a measure of buyer's remorse, and we might want to remove those we've just elected rather more quickly than the arrangements allow. Nevertheless, those are in our hands, and there are things that we want from the European Union. I certainly want a much greater level of freedom of movement. I certainly want a diminution of the non-tariff barriers that have been imposed. And these things are available to us by negotiation. Of course, they will come at a price, but it will be for us and our elected representatives to determine whether that price is worth paying. Brexit has already delivered. We are governed by people that we elect and whom we can remove. It is for us to seize the opportunity. Carpe diem.